First, well, I'm delighted. Yes. So yeah, to remind everyone that the meeting is being recorded. Just the notification I got on my screen. So yeah, I'm delighted to be chairing this fourth webinar as part of our project on the role of social partners in preventing third-party violence and harassment at work, with much emphasis on public services. My name is Nadia Salson, and I'm a policy officer at EPSU, the European Federation of Public Service Unions. And I have the pleasure to be coordinating this project. So first, perhaps some domestic matters. You can speak in English, French, Spanish, Hungarian, and Italian. And I think you're all used to using Zoom now, but at the bottom of your screen, you will have the sort of globe icon with interpretation. And here, yes, indeed, thanks a lot for putting the logos of the different project partners. And as I was saying, please do not hesitate to put the camera on. It makes it a bit more, lively, and we can see your reaction. If you wish to speak, you can either use the chat or use the yellow hand also at the bottom of your screen, entitled reactions. Today, so we will finish at 12:30. There will be no break. So, but I'm sure that the discussions with the number of very interesting speakers will keep us all alert until 12:30. So today, the focus of our webinar is looking at the specific nature of violence via digital tool. In other words, it can be called cyber violence, cyberbullying, also cyber stalking, different expressions, but also the extent to which digitalization might be causing violent behaviors through an intensification of work, failing services sometimes, which is causing frustrations among citizens using the services. But at the same time, the extent to which also online tools, digitalization can be part of the measures to support victims of violence. So I think that will be a very interesting topic. Digitalization is really almost the only game in town right now in Brussels. There's been lots of initiatives, or increasingly a high number of initiatives taken by social partners on digitalization, and there is also quite a substantial European Commission's agenda on digitalization. But I would like first perhaps to remind that so this webinar, for those of you who have not attended previous webinars, is part of a broader project putting together 8 social partners. And I'm very grateful to them to have come together to really look at what more we can do as social partners to prevent third-party violence and harassment. And the projects are here on the screen. So in addition to EPSU, we have CESI, ETUCE for the education sector, ETF, transport, and OSPIM for the hospital on the employer side, CMR, local and regional governments, UITP for the transport, and ETNO for the private telecom sector. So the objective of the project, why first did we come together? I think it's always important to remind ourselves. One, the first reason is that some of us, a majority of the partners, sign up to a set of policy guidelines 11 years ago, back in 2010, on the prevention of third-party violence and harassment. And that was, I believe, the first time that such a joint policy document was adopted, specifically on violence or harassment by users against workers. And it was at the time building upon a cross-sectoral agreement on violence and harassment at work, but we wanted at the time to really specifically look at what we also call external violence. So one of the main reasons was to look at the implementation, to look at the implementation of the guidelines at national level 11 years after the adoption of the guidelines. And we will come back to it in the second part of today's seminar, the extent to which the guidelines have been implemented, if not why, and do they need to be updated in light of recent legislative developments at national level or EU level, in light of new collective agreements, and also in light of the ILO Convention 190, which specifically looks at gender-based violence, including at work and including third-party violence. But the second reason we also thought it was important to come together is that we have seen across our different sectors, local, regional government, prison services, hospitals, transport, secondary schools, a reported increase of violence against workers. And that's really become a concern. And there is some commitment, so I think from all of us, to try and find better solutions and measures to tackle this problem. So that's in a nutshell what the project is about. I would like, before going through the agenda, to share 2 points for information. First, you might have seen that some of the project partners, EPSU, CESI, CMR, and ETUC, adopted a statement on the 25th of November to mark the International Day against Violence Against Women. And that statement gave much emphasis on a pending directive on gender-based violence. And we put together some of the key points discussed at the second webinar of the project, looking at gender-based violence. So just wanted to say that that statement has been sent to the European Commission, and last week we actually had a discussion with the Commission on the plans regarding the content of this directive, and basically really drew attention to the importance of giving the directive a workplace dimension, and also to allow some space for the role of social partners. The Commission told us that the directive would be now put forward on the 8th of March. And although there is no guarantee that our demands would be taken into account, I believe there was some understanding of the importance of tackling also gender-based violence at the workplace. So I think it's a space to watch, and we might want to come back to the European Commission in the next few months. And the second point I wanted to share with you is that just 2 days ago, the European Parliament adopted a report on the fight against cyber violence, which is exactly one of the key topics for today. And the report includes a number of interesting data, but we will come back to it with our speakers today, but only to share that according to the European Parliament's research, it's between 4 to 7% of women, specifically in the European Union, who would have experienced cyber harassment, so harassment online, during the 12 months before the survey was being carried out, while between 1 and 3% have experienced cyber stalking. So that's quite a significant number, because that's across the European Union. And another survey, the World Wide Web Foundation, which was conducted in 2020, in a survey among citizens from 180 countries, revealed that 52% of young women and girls have experienced online abuse, such as the sharing of private images, videos, or messages without their consent. And the statistics go up to 64% of respondents who stated that they know someone who have experienced it. And I must say I belong to that statistics. So I think that what we are dealing with today is quite a serious matter. And the only thing with this report by the European Parliament, which is a welcome initiative, is that it does not actually allow for a workplace dimension. There is no reference to the role of social partners. And that's, which is a pity. And the ETUC actually wrote to the members of the European Parliament to express their concerns, because it's very important that indeed we have a strong role to play. And that will be actually one of the key objectives of today, is to share our practices, our concerns, and try and find solutions. So that's my introduction. I will now give the floor to Jane Pillinger, who is a very loyal and skillful project consultant, to take us through, well, two things, in fact. One will be to recap quickly, to refresh our memory regarding the third webinar, which focused on health risk assessment. And I believe we will come back to that, because that's an essential tool when we talk about preventive measures regarding violence and harassment. And Jane will also share with us the latest findings of the research. You know that there is an online survey which is being done. And I believe now we will close the survey by... Sorry, excuse me, there is some background noise. Yeah, if you can, yeah, thank you. So Jane will also take us through the latest research findings, and yeah, the survey will be closed before, well, I mean, at the end of next week, basically. So Jane, if you want to please take the floor, thank you.
Yeah, thanks ever so much, Nadia, and great to have that context around digitalization. And there's one thing that I just wanted to add to that, in terms of one of the issues that's covered in the project, which is domestic violence. And in fact, we discussed this briefly in the webinar on gender-based violence, that domestic violence is often perpetrated in the workplace through digital tools, through stalking by text messages, online, it could be through social media and so on, which impacts on women workers in particular, who are survivors of domestic violence, their capacity to work productively. And I think this is really interesting in relation to the findings that Nadia just presented about the extent of and the growing levels of what we sometimes refer to as digital sexual abuse that's occurring. So I think it's really good to have that context. But before I just give a brief overview of some of the survey findings in relation to digitalization, I wanted to just give a brief overview of the webinar 3 that was held on the 25th of October on looking at risks and risk assessment in relation to third-party violence and harassment. And I think for everybody that was at the webinar, it was a really fascinating, interesting, quite groundbreaking discussion about how we can bring issues of risk assessment in occupational safety and health into discussions about prevention of third-party violence and harassment, which has tended to stay outside of those frameworks and indeed outside of national laws. So, for example, the EU OSHA gave some presentations at the webinar about risk assessment as a mechanism around prevention of violence and harassment, and particularly of OSH hazards in the workplace, and how, you know, the 1989 directive, the framework directive on occupational safety and health, gives us the framework for that. And that range of tools have been developed with EU OSHA, but also other tools that have been really trying to give a focus on both prevention of violence and harassment, which is a relatively new issue in occupational safety and health, but in relation also to bringing that into the issues of risk assessment tools that address third-party violence and harassment. And there was some really great examples from the social partners, the ETUCE and the EFEE, which are the employers and the unions at the European level in the education sector, have worked through EU OSHA in developing the AURA tool, which is a tool for risk assessment that is based on a sectoral perspective. And the tool has been very productive and useful in raising awareness around these issues in the education sector, and is likely also to be now extended into other parts of the higher education and vocational training sector in the future. So I found those, and I think everybody found those examples really useful. It was really interesting in the discussion as well, because we were looking at why these risks of third-party violence and harassment are growing. Some of this is to do with the political and the social context, to do with COVID, to do with more risks being evident as a result of stress and growing levels of aggression, but also it could be linked to, from a union perspective, reduction in resources for public services, higher demands on managers, staffing levels, and so on, around ensuring that there's better prevention. And then there were some very nice examples from the social partners as well in the second part of the webinar, which was looking at national examples. And there was one, for example, a project in the Netherlands on safe healthcare, an initiative, a social dialogue initiative, which has been leading the issue of third-party violence and harassment in the hospital sector through a training program, through liaison with the police and so on, that's been very effective. And there was another example from Italy of collective agreements that are addressing third-party violence and harassment in local authority social services sectors, and a groundbreaking agreement that has really set this in train in the municipality of Genoa. So I think all of those examples show some really good initiatives on the ground, and particularly, now we're going to be looking at the issue of digitalization. Obviously, digitalization is both an opportunity and a risk, and we need to bring that into risk management and risk assessment programs. And I think, in relation to some of the recommendations and ways forward that were suggested by webinar participants, there's an importance of addressing issues such as staff training around de-escalation measures, about raising awareness of staff in terms of recognizing signs of aggression, continuous cycles of learning, making the issue more visible, dealing with some of the risks such as lone work, which are often not defined in our collective agreements or workplace policies, and having a continuous cycle of learning on this issue. So I think the webinar was really interesting for people in understanding both how we can develop the guidelines perhaps around the specific focus on prevention, because this is clearly an issue that everybody is concerned about as third-party violence and harassment clearly has been increasing in relation to not just the recent pandemic, it was increasing before then, but also how we can prevent its occurrence. So my second brief part of the presentation is just to say a few words about the update on the third-party violence survey, which many of you, I think, have already completed. We're just keeping open for a little bit longer in case there's anybody else that wants to add their examples and to give us some feedback. So if you haven't completed the survey, please do. You can find the links to the survey on this address, and the survey is available, as I think many of you know, in 10 languages. It's available as an online survey, which is the easiest way to complete it. But if you have problems with that, or the internet breaks down, sometimes it's a problem in completing it. There is a Word version as well, which can be emailed directly back to me. We're going to be closing this survey very soon, but we'll all be disappearing off for the Christmas break very soon. But effectively, it will be closed from the end of December. And then we'll start doing some of the analysis of the results. As of yesterday, we've had responses from 181 organisations. As many of you know, the survey is directed towards social partner organisations at the national level, of unions and of employers. And so far, this is the balance of the responses. We've had 48% responses from trade unions, and 62 responses from employers' organisations. And just to give you a recap of just some of the initial findings, preliminary findings, overall from these responses as of yesterday, 63% of respondents are saying that third-party violence is an extremely serious or very serious problem. 46% say that it has negatively impacted on the quality of the services provided, and 47% say that it's had, in the context of COVID, has had a very big impact. I've just drawn out some of the findings in relation to digitalisation, and I thought it was quite interesting that just over 9.5% of respondents have said that their services went online as a result of COVID. And what might be interesting to know is whether, when those services went online, whether that's where there was a specific, direct increase in abuse as a result, digital forms of abuse and online abuse. And we'll be able to look into that deeper in the survey. But I wanted to give you this slide, which is just reporting on the preliminary findings in relation to types of third-party violence and harassment that are reported in, and we gave options in the survey for people to say what are the predominant forms of third-party violence and harassment in your sector, your workplace, and so on. And we see here that cyber harassment, including online, text and telephone harassment, is the 5th most predominant type of third-party violence and harassment reported. And that equates to 15% who are reporting that cyber harassment is a prominent type of third-party violence and harassment. So I think that's quite an interesting finding. Obviously, we haven't got anything to benchmark that on in terms of pre-COVID data. But I think it's useful to know that that is a concern of many of the social partners. So that's just a brief overview, and I just put up the data from Nadia's introduction that she referred to, so that we can have that record of that for the webinar. And I think it's really interesting that, levels of cyber stalking and cyber harassment appear to be increasing. So this is a very, very timely webinar, and we're looking forward to some really interesting discussions and hearing from our experts. So thank you very much, and back over to you, Nadia.
Thanks, Jane. Thanks for the report of the previous webinar. And again, as I said, we will certainly come back to the use of risk assessments, the extent to which they are being conducted, which is again, an employer's duty, obligations since, for the past 20 years as part of the EU Health and Safety Directive, and the extent to which risk assessments indeed do try and prevent or take into account violence, third-party violence, harassment, and now cyber violence, which is today's discussion. And regarding the survey, so for everyone, really, you have the last chance to fill it in by the end of next week, and I'm sure you will not want to do that on the 24th. So please don't hesitate. It's already a good number of responses to the survey. I found it interesting that there are more employers' organizations than trade unions who responded to it, which is usually the other way around in terms of participation rate to our webinars. But I suppose we will also have to look at the to some extent, the representativeness of the responding organization. But it's, I think that's certainly, it's important to always to validate, what we think is important, especially when you work in Brussels, representing large organizations, and it's sometimes difficult to really pinpoint what, what should be dealt with. And clearly here it seems we are on the right track based on the responses, that indeed there is a large number of respondents who do who do think that third-party violence is actually increasing, and indeed this is a serious matter. At the same time, I mean, the figures, that's the thing when we talk about violence or harassment, and I believe also cyber violence, is that even if the numbers were lower, the impact on the individual is huge. And also the impact on the colleagues of that person, as well as on the whole culture at the workplace. So that's also why it's an extremely important matter. Right, well, we are just in time for our first sort of panel discussion, not really panel discussion, because that will be like, standalone presentations. But really the idea now is to take us more into greater depths with the data we have, the expertise we have on the phenomenon of cyber violence, cyber bullying. We will come back, I believe, to the definitions. So we will have this session until 11:40 more or less. And I'm very pleased that we have with us Matthias Wouters, who is one of the co-authors of an interesting interesting report by the ILO, really which is entitled Upgrading Protection of Workers against Cyber Violence. And I believe it's one of the first sort of comparative international study on that. And you have the link to that ILO report in the agenda. And and it's available in English, French, and Spanish. And I really recommend you to have a look, because there is also some interesting findings, and Matthias will mention them, but across a number of public services. So I find the study very interesting, and the study also mentions the guidelines we have adopted on the prevention of third-party violence and harassment. So Matthias will give us a feel of those findings, and the report was recently done, so it's still quite fresh findings. And then I'm very pleased that we have again the participation with us of the EU Health and Safety Agency, OSHA, with Tim Tregenza, who is the senior network manager. It's an intriguing title, job position. Perhaps you can tell us more about it, but much more importantly, it's very important that we have the support of OSHA, which again took part in the previous webinar on risk assessment, and OSHA has been developing a comparative tool to help management and also trade unions to carry out good risk assessments. And Tim will tell us much more on the scale, the extent, the scale and the impact of cyber violence at the workplace. And then we will have a couple of interventions, and I'm very pleased that the ETUC, the European Trade Union Confederation, has agreed to give us some of the key points of the cross-sectoral agreement on digitalization, which was adopted last year. And as part of this agreement, there is a provision on violence, and Aline will tell us a bit more about this. And the ETUC is also much involved in the promotion of the ILO Convention 190. And she'll also bring us up to speed on, I believe, the state of ratification by member states, but that will be quick, because I understand that's only one and perhaps a second one soon. So. And then we will have an intervention by our colleague project partner from the ETUC, Martina Di Ridolfo, who has some also very recent information to share with us, with a new statement adopted just yesterday on digitalization at the Sectoral Social Dialogue Committee in the education sector. So on digitalization, with, I believe, also some provisions regarding violence. and also another statement which was agreed by the education social partners. So many thanks to our speakers for agreeing to speak at today's webinar. And I will first give the floor to Matthias regarding the ILO report on cyber violence. Thank you. And I believe you want to share a presentation, Matthias. Will you do it yourself?
Yeah, I'd like to do it myself. That's the easiest way, I guess. Thank you, Nadia.
Okay, thank you.
Is it working?
Fine.
Okay, then here we go. So as Nadia said, my name is Matthias Wouters. I work still at the Institute for Labor Law of KU Leuven, and much of what I will say today is based on this research which we did in 2019, but it was eventually published in 2020, at the time when the ILO Convention on Violence and Harassment at Work was being drafted. So today's presentation is more or less based on that research, and if you want any more information about what it will be said, you can always consult the report and feel free to email me at any point if that's convenient. I'll try to stick to my time. I don't think it will last 30 minutes. I'll try to stick at 20, but it's important to first point out that we were, or the people contributing to this research were legal researchers. So this was mostly comparative legal research in which we went and took a look into domestic legislations to see what kind of laws were being used to address cyberbullying at work. The focus was explicitly on cyberbullying. That was what the International Labour Office asked us, and more specifically, cyberbullying at work, in the workplace, at the world of work. Now, the problem with this is that cyberbullying is a term that isn't used that much in legal writings and in laws in general. Those are more targeted towards bullying and harassment as such, and not so much the cyber element. And then also bullying is a phenomenon that is much more widespread than just in the world of work. So many of these laws also are applicable beyond the world of work. So that kind of made it difficult to target this phenomenon from a legal point of view. And I'll explain later on how that, well, meant that we took a look at a broad swath of different forms of legislation and different instruments that could be of help. But the structure of today's presentation is this one: first some preliminary remarks, and then afterwards I'll take a look at some country examples. These are not best practices, they're just examples that I use to kind of give an explanation, and I'll finish off with some concluding remarks. So in terms of preliminary remarks, one of the first issues that we encountered were the descriptions used in research to measure cyberbullying, as well as the definitions used in legal instruments. So at least in the sociological and other forms of quantitative and qualitative research, oftentimes we found that cyberbullying built on this idea of bullying. So first there was a definition of what is bullying, and then kind of how that interrelates with the cyber variant of bullying. Bullying generally had a couple of major components. So one was that there needs to be a certain persistence repetition, the idea that you bully someone by performing an act a couple of times a week, not just once. Then also this idea that it should at least have some duration, take a while, and also this idea of an unequal power relation that develops between the perpetrator of bullying and the victim. As I said, most definitions surrounding cyberbullying, they kind of built on this initial idea of what is bullying, but there are many interesting observations when we think about cyberbullying in particular. I noted them down here on my paper because it was hard to memorize them. So first, in terms of repetition, many scholars have noted that in case of cyberbullying, repetition often takes a different form. So instead of doing the same kind of cyber violent acts over and over again, it might be the case that someone just posts a picture or a text message once, after which the effect of that one text keeps on popping up again and again and again. So it's not so much the repetition of the act. There's only one cyberbullying act, but it's the effect of that one act that keeps on repeating itself. And also there's this idea of a snowballing effect. So I might send a text message to someone only once, but then someone else might pick up on that text message and replicate it or retweet something, or after a while there are different people who don't necessarily have the intention to bully anyone, but it keeps on adding, piling up, and develops into this kind of snowball effect. So in terms of cyberbullying, we might have to reconsider what is needed in terms of repetition. Also, another difficult issue with cyberbullying is that oftentimes these kinds of acts are unerasable. So if you have face-to-face bullying, the act might be very problematic, but usually after the act has been completed, unless it is repeated, it's done. The act has been committed, and that's it basically. Whilst in terms of cyberbullying, some of these issues are practically unerasable. Also, a third issue is the idea of anonymity. So if you're kind of tech savvy and skilled, it becomes possible to bully someone in a more or less anonymous way. And also this anonymity kind of can result in different forms of unequal power relations between someone who is working at the ICT department, for instance, and has many skills in this regard, and someone else who might not have any skills or not much more than your average Joe using a computer. The fourth one, and also a very, very important one, is the way in which the cyber element can break down the division between work and private spheres. So for instance, if you have teachers who might be bullied by pupils at work, of course, these cyber tools like social media, they can also extend that bullying into the private sphere and make it much more difficult to escape from those bullying acts. And then there are also two other things I would like to note that at least we found in our research. So the idea of moral or emotional detachment between the perpetrator and the victim in case of cyberbullying. So if you do face-to-face bullying, oftentimes when you bully someone, you will be immediately confronted with the consequences of your act. Whereas if you do cyberbullying, usually it will take a while before you actually observe the effect it has on that victim. And because there's this kind of disconnect between what you do and the effect on the victim, in some cases, it might be more easy on an emotional level for someone to perpetrate cyberbullying than face-to-face bullying. And also a sixth element is that in case of cyberbullying, there might be fewer bystanders than is the case with face-to-face bullying. So bystanders can have a negative or a positive impact on the bullying effect. And in the case of cyberbullying, there generally are less bystanders that can actively intervene to stop that bullying. And that might also complicate things. Other things we noticed in terms of definitions or the actual phenomenon is that it's very hard to do comparative research between different legal traditions and languages because the terms are difficult to translate. It's often hard to translate the English concept of bullying into other languages because it's difficult to get the same sense of what does this mean and what are the implications. The ILO also asked us to give an idea of incidents. How often does this happen, cyberbullying? This was pretty difficult to get a grip on because most researchers, they use their own kind of definition of what they consider to be cyberbullying or an act of cyber violence. And so it's not so easy to compare those findings. But these are a few. In the research, you would see that we tried to define what the researchers identify as cyberbullying in the footnote, but couldn't include that here. So for instance, in the first one, we see that 14 to 20% of university employees would have experienced cyberbullying behaviors at least once a week. 22% of teachers in the Czech Republic reported to have experienced a cyber attack. and so forth. We can see that it is indeed a very serious phenomenon and that it takes place on a large scale. But as I said, it's hard to really have a comprehensive idea of the numbers because there's so much difference in terms of what is being measured between all of those studies. What is also important, at least we think, is to see or to at least have an understanding of who is perpetrating that act of cyberbullying. And to our own surprise, many of these researchers actually found that most of the cyberbullying is being committed by people inside of the organization, or at least close to the organization. Now it's kind of hard to know why this is the case, because to some extent you would expect cyberbullying to also be perpetrated by outsiders, but maybe it has to do with this idea of bullying being a repeated act. So the fact that there is so much cyberbullying internal compared to external might not imply that there's not a lot of cyber violence in general from external partners. So you can imagine at school that these teachers are being subjected to nasty comments by those parents, but that doesn't necessarily amount to bullying if that parent only issues that comment once and doesn't issue it again and again. So it might have to do with this idea that bullying is repeated, which is perhaps a reason why it's mostly measured internally. Also, it's very important to note that when you're trying to figure out who is cyberbullying, like 40% of those acts are not identified and clear in 40% of those cases who has committed cyberbullying. And perhaps external bullies are more hard to identify. So it could be that among those anonymous cyberbullies, most people are external. That's also something to take into consideration. Then who is targeted? It's not something we focused on, but we have no reason to believe that it is. We would think that it's completely reasonable to think that young women and girls, for instance, are at a greater risk of encountering cyber violence also at work. We didn't search the numbers on this, but for instance, in the case of female journalists, it's clear that they are more subjected to cyber violence, as well as female members of parliament. So there are certain examples that kind of give a hint that this could also be the case in the world at work. Now, some other things I'd like to point out real quickly. We had the impression that bullying seems to occur more often than cyberbullying, and also that those two often go hand in hand. So it's not the case that someone acts as a bully or a cyberbully. Oftentimes they will do both. And that might also have to do with why internal cyberbullying is such a persistent phenomenon, because they engage in both face-to-face and cyberbullying. This was also mentioned earlier on, the fact that it has very significant consequences for victims and also for the workplace at large. So there's interesting research about the extent to which bullying acts and cyberbullying acts impact bystanders and other colleagues at work, and how it completely derails those persons' experience of work and is bad for productivity and other indicators that also matter to the business. So as you would read in our research, there are valid reasons to consider this a priority for both employers and workers. Now, coming to the regulatory angle, we were surprised that there were so many different kinds of laws and regulations that matter in this sphere. So first of all, you have general labor laws and labor codes. Oftentimes, the law will impose a kind of duty of care on employers, and then it might be the case that in the labor codes, it's kind of specified what that means, and that preventing forms of psychosocial risks and other things that might lead to harassment, that is part of the duty of care. On the other hand, also employees can have a duty to make sure that they don't harm their colleagues. So there's also a way to connect it to those provisions. Then occupational safety and health laws are often very important. Non-discrimination laws can be important. So Sometimes an act of harassment or bullying can also be a discriminatory act. And that is important because non-discrimination laws often have quite a broad scope of application. So they could also apply to self-employed individuals. And so if you bully someone, a self-employed individual, for discriminatory reasons, that might be captured under non-discrimination laws, whereas it's difficult to capture under general labor law. Same thing with human rights instruments. So severe forms of bullying can infringe on human dignity. And for that reason, sometimes it's also captured under general human rights instruments. So there are many instruments it might actually interact with. Not to forget instruments that deal with cyberspace in general. So I will come to an act on harmful digital communication at the end. But it's also important to think of general data protection law. For instance, you can think of if someone has an evaluation in the form of staff appraisal, it's not always needed to keep those records tens of years and to risk those records being exposed to other persons that might use them to engage in an act of cyber bullying. It's also just important to make sure that you limit the exposure of certain records, and those kinds of acts or those kind of preventive measures can also help risk the extent of bullying. Then companies' internal policies are extremely relevant. Those internal policies can be very diverse. So extreme forms are prohibitions of dating on the work floor. So the idea that you can't date someone within the organization. But other policies could be this idea of if you get one warning, a second warning, and then a third warning, at the third warning, you're dismissed. So you only get 3 chances, and at the third problem, you get dismissal. There are many of these kind of internal policies that make a significant difference. Now, I wanted to mainly talk about 3 kind of country examples. They're not best practices, but I think they kind of highlight 3 things that are very important when we think about cyberbullying. So the first one is prevention, the second one is deterrence, and the third one is online deterrence. Moving to the first one, prevention, I used my own country because it's kind of a complicated process, and I wanted to take an example that I felt comfortable with. So in Belgium, we had this law dating from 2002, but it has undergone many changes. And the idea is mainly to prevent cyberbullying and other forms of bullying from happening in the first place. So there are obligations on the employer to take preventive measures. And if the employer doesn't take sufficient preventive measures, that employer risks being sanctioned. Then additionally, there's also this kind of system in place to make sure that employees that are being bullied have sufficient recourse. And in this respect, it relies on what you can call a cascade system. The idea that you start off small, if that's possible, through an informal intervention. So in case of an informal intervention, you ask what is called a trusted person under the legislation to be confidential and to start a kind of reconciliation process between the perpetrator and the victim. So this is kind of a process that doesn't lead to significant legal acts. Then you have a formal intervention, in which case you ask a professional prevention advisor to intervene. Those prevention advisors are professionally trained in occupational safety and health, including psychosocial risks. And in that case, if you ask for a formal intervention, you get dismissal protection, and the prevention advisor will engage in consultations with bystanders, witnesses, and everyone else, also with the idea of drafting instructions to the employer about how to prevent this kind of act in the future. And then you have a third and fourth kind of possibility where you, of course, engage in much more severe legal acts. But the general idea is to have a cascade system. So if a person that is bullied immediately goes to the court can also just suspend the proceedings and ask the individuals to first engage in informal and formal forms of intervention internally within the organization. So that is something that in Belgium, at least, is being seen as very relevant, this idea to start off small, if possible. Of course, in some instances, it's not possible to start off small and you need to immediately grab the big guns, but oftentimes it's better to start off on a smaller note. Then the idea of deterrence, I took this Spanish example because they have an article in the criminal code that has been used in cases of severe bullying. So this is an article that was already in vogue, already in effect before 2010. And it kind of, well, it targets more than just bullying, but acts that harm the moral integrity of the person. And it has a significant punishment connected to it. Now, apparently this was being used in cases of severe bullying in the world of work before, but not that often. And so in 2010, they made amendments and they added the second paragraph. The second paragraph is more focused on employment and civil servants relationships. But what is crucial to this paragraph is that the act of bullying needs to take advantage of a relationship of superiority. And this criterion is very interesting because it's difficult to qualify what a relationship of superiority is. Of course, if someone is another person's manager and the other person is a subordinate, then you can say that, of course, there's a kind of relationship of superiority. But there could also be other kinds of relationships of superiority, potentially, at least, depending on how this kind of criterion is interpreted. For instance, you can think of someone from the ICT service, again, who is acting as a cyberbully in relation to other individuals within the firm. In that case, if that individual has much more knowledge about technology and ICT matters, is that a relationship of superiority? Perhaps it depends on how you interpret that criterion. Same thing, for instance, in my situation, I had colleagues who came to our university, but who didn't speak Dutch and who didn't study at the university. Of course, that kind of gives me much more knowledge, and I am in a position of superiority in the sense that I have a better understanding of where to find information. If I would take advantage of that position, is that also a relationship of superiority? It's difficult to qualify this kind of criterion. An example that clearly shows this as well is one that again happened in Belgium. So Article 119 of the Penal Code, it sanctions forms of bullying that take place in relation to employees at work. And in this particular instance, there was a woman who went to a garage, I believe, as an employee, just to engage in sales or something like that. But the person was filmed in the toilets, and that person wanted to engage with this Article 119 and sentence the client of her employer for bullying acts. But the courts found that there was no contact between those individuals, between the employer that installed the camera in the bathroom and the victim that came into that bathroom. Just the fact that there was a camera that would have recorded her wasn't enough to constitute contact. And for that reason, the article couldn't be called upon. Then a third element, which I think is absolutely crucial in the case of cyberbullying, are these kind of general laws that enable courts to file court orders against content hosts in this case. So we're thinking about Facebook, for instance, but that could also be, I think, an employer as such. So an employer could be an online content host and asked by the court to to reveal who has sent a particular message, for instance. But it's also absolutely crucial to have these kind of acts to break the anonymity that sometimes occurs in the case of cyberbullying. So these are three kinds of dimensions that interrelate and interact with one another, but I think it's absolutely crucial to, at least at the domestic level, have something in each of these areas. And then moving to the concluding remarks, overall, there are at least two things that have been very important in our research. So this idea that many of the provisions on bullying are still relevant to use, but there are often these kinds of criterions that are problematic to then extend this kind of article into cyberspace. So it's important to reevaluate those laws and collective bargaining agreements and policies to see if any changes have to occur to make sure that they remain effective also in relation to certain forms of cyberbullying. Also, the idea that some of the scopes of these protections might be too limited. For instance, you could have former employees who basically left the company because they felt bullied. And it might be necessary to make sure that those persons can afterwards still take advantage of policies that are applicable to people bullied in the company itself. So it's not necessarily because someone has left the company that then that person shouldn't have access to infrastructure within the company that is set up to contrast, to counteract bullying. And then I noticed a couple of other points that I think are extremely important to consider when trying to address cyberbullying, but also bullying more in general. So at least in the Belgian experience, we have the impression that it is crucial to have people in place that know what they need to do in the case of bullying and harassment. So if you have a prevention advisor that is an expert in occupational safety and health, that doesn't make that person a psychologist or someone who has a lot of experience in dealing with bullying. Likewise, if you go to the courts are not that often confronted with these kind of cases. So it might make sense to concentrate these kind of cases in one court in the country, for instance, in Brussels, in Belgium, instead of having them being litigated all across the country. Also, qualified bystander responsibility. The idea that, well, of course, the employer having to be responsible in general to keep the employment setting safe is good in and of itself, but the notion of an employer is often pretty vague. Who is my employer? It might also be worthwhile to have a more concrete obligation in relation to direct supervisors to intervene. So if a direct supervisor notices that someone is being bullied, if that direct supervisor doesn't intervene, you could kind of keep that person responsible as a, not of course as a co-bully, but at least as someone who hasn't intervened, even though it would have been in his capacity to do so. And it's not like that supervisor has to be dismissed in that case, but it could be that that person needs to then follow courses on bullying or anything like that, or that the end of the year bonus is in jeopardy because of that. Democratization of the workplace. So the idea that data protection, impact assessment, and risk assessments, that workers are more involved in those. That is something that is to be well, supported in general, but it could also have very important consequences about how in terms of how the workplace is being run. Also in light of what might give danger to bullying and harassment. Also, this idea that the employer of the perpetrator might become liable, that is something that is generally not foreseen in domestic legislation, but it could be important. So for instance, if you are an employee of an employer and the clients of that employer, one of those employees is bullying the other one, then it might be worthwhile to also keep the employer of the perpetrator to account. And also the duty of care is very important in this kind of setting, but oftentimes it is very vague what that implies. And that is also a liability for employers who might end up being called to account because they might not have implemented that duty of care. So employers have a kind of reason to be more specific about how they try to prevent these kind of issues. And in case they comply with those preventive measures, that they risk their duty of care of being called upon at a later stage. So there are also reasons for employers to be more concrete about what they understand their duty of care to mean. So those are some kind of specific ideas that you can find in our paper. And with that, that was the final slide. If there are any questions later on, I am completely willing to answer those.
Many thanks, Matthias. I mean, you're indeed a labor law expert, postdoctoral researcher, and at the same time, so you provided us, a huge amount of knowledge on the legal framework, the interaction of different pieces of legislation, health and safety, labor law in general, anti-discrimination. And at the same time, I think you provided us with interesting practical recommendations, and I'm sure that some of the employers delegates at the meeting today will be happy to perhaps comment also on the how to define, to be more specific on the employer's duty to care. That would be an interesting one. So many thanks. What I would like to do now is to move on to the next speaker, unless there are any questions of clarification, because then we will have time for discussion on content. But any questions on the wording? I mean, we heard also different, definitions, bullying, stalking, harassment. But what I keep in mind, and I think in terms of cyberbullying, is this notion of repetition, but which can also be complicated, as it was said, because they can be different, repetition, but with different acts. And so in terms then of, reparation, litigation, it can be complicated. The Belgium case with the obligation to have contact. So obviously in terms of cyber violence, that also makes it different. So I think one of the key messages was the importance of reviewing and if necessary, and it seems to be the case, updating our tools in terms of legislation or collective agreements too, but we'll come back to that. I do not see any yellow hands at the center. Ah, yes, sorry, there is one. Dominique, the floor is yours.
Oui, bonjour, oui, j'ai une question, c'est une précision. Le terme de démocratisation du lieu de travail, enfin de la place de travail, a été utilisé. Je peux me poser la question, ce que ça voulait dire exactement, quoi.
Matthias, if you want, step in.
In this particular instance, I don't mean it in a very intrusive way. I merely mean to say that the involvement of workers in these kind of risk assessments and data protection impact assessments might help to identify reasons why cyberbullying might take place, because in all honesty, employers might not always know. They might just not be aware of some of the risk factors. So democratization of work, I didn't mean it in a very intrusive or far-fetched way, more in a limited sense in this particular instance.
I'm sorry, Nadia, you're muted.
Yes, democracy at work is a running thread in a trade union, and also I believe in some employers' organization, and basically to involve workers and their trade union reps also in a number of, in prevention measures, not least, for instance, risk assessment, for instance, or supporting the victim, supporting litigation. Jane, you have a question of clarification?
Yes, it was just a question whether, thank you, Matthias, for such an interesting presentation. I just wanted to ask the question whether during your research, if you came across any good practice collective bargaining agreements or workplace policies, because one of the things we're doing in the research for this project is collecting together some good practice examples. And this is perhaps one area where we found less examples, probably because it's a relatively new issue for many companies and social partners. So if you were, through your research, came across good examples, we'd love it if you could share them with us, because the language that's used and the definitions that used might be quite interesting for us in terms of, you know, any updating that takes place of the guidelines.
Yes, this has also been a general problem that we observed. So we wanted to indeed find companies as well that have intriguing, innovative new ways of tackling these kind of issues, but it was just very difficult to get our hands on any of those concrete examples. And if we found them, they were examples that weren't evaluated. And so that's also a general problem. I think that also these kinds of laws, like the Belgian one, that it all sounds very extensive, and it is extensive, but on a level of evaluation, there's really nothing concrete or very little. So there might be some kind of public outcry because of some heinous form of bullying, and then the act gets amended and changed, but there's no systematic follow-up about how it is actually being used. So we also found it very difficult to come up with best practices that have actually been vetted and that we objectively know that they work.
Thanks, Matthias. Yes, indeed, reviewing, monitoring is key, and implementing what we agree or what the law says is always a difficult one. But hopefully today, during the discussions, we will have maybe other examples. So, and in any case, we'll trigger perhaps more attention to it. I will now pass on the floor to Tim Tregenza from the EU Health and Safety Agency, and then we will pass on to Aline from the ETUC and Martina, ETUC, so that you have an idea of when you're going to step in. Tim Tregenza, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I am just going to share my screen. Can you see my screen? Yes, hopefully you can see it and hear me.
Yes, very fine. Thank you.
Jolly good. Thank you very much for the invitation. You mentioned my job title at this introduction to the seminar. The senior part in that title is just to remind me I'm old. The network manager means I work with many different occupational safety and health networks around Europe, including Senior Labour Inspectors Committee and our National Focal Points Network. Perhaps more interesting in relation to this topic is I am also a confidential counsellor here in the European Agency for Safety and Health at Work, which is a mechanism for preventing and supporting where there have been cases of harassment, for example. So where I'm going to focus today is really much on workplace prevention. I have a couple of slides at the back of my presentation which have some definitions I found and references. I won't present them, but they're there for information. So let's see if this goes on. There we go. Okay, and what I would say that in the context of digitalization, I think I can highlight 3 areas where this is impacting on third-party violence and harassment at work. And I'll also highlight here one change that we are seeing that is impacting on health and safety management. So one of the big changes we're seeing, of course, with digitalization is telework. And of course, the pandemic has made this much more of a topic. With telework, what we're seeing are different communication measures. We're all on Zoom, management by email, management by telephone, working from home. And one of the things there is sometimes there are different management expectations because managers need to manage differently. And this is where we still can see bullying via Zoom. We can still see micromanagement remotely. These things are still happening, but with the bullying behavior is still going on, but their mechanisms are changing in teleworking. The second way we're seeing this digital access to services. So people are changing their expectations. Yeah, nowadays with digital access to services, you can buy something instantly. I want instant feedback. I want instant delivery. This means that when something goes wrong, people can get more frustrated and be lashing out at the first human they actually meet on a system. We all know that's a fun game where you go through a web system and then it fails, and then you have to phone somebody up. As has been mentioned, online can mean anonymous, and this has a huge impact on behaviors and harassment. And also, the speed of sharing information is so much faster. So whereas a face-to-face harassment, for example, is highly unpleasant, but it happens in a set place and time. And it can be repeated. It is repeated if it's bullying and harassment, basically. But now with online harassment, online violence, you can share. There are things like you have, what you in fact can see are things like what are called social media pylons. So somebody makes an unpleasant, aggressive comment on somebody's social media, and then everybody who they're linked to them, they then join in and amplify the damage. So we're seeing these changes because of the digital process. And the third dimension I'd mention here is this blurring between private life and work life. In terms of bullying, your manager may expect you to be working 24/7. And the other thing is, just because I may be a teacher, I may have a Facebook, a social media account, TikTok, name it, whatever it is. But now all of a sudden, my pupils, my boss, my colleagues can get access to that and can use that as a vector for harassment and abuse. So these are three big ways where we're seeing digitalization impacting on third-party violence and harassment at work. And I would highlight here that as a result of all this, the data protection is now a health and safety issue. When you're doing your health and safety management, you have to consider the data protection. Why should my boss have access to my private email? Why should my boss have access to my personal phone number? Can a student get access to my data? Can a parent get access to my data via the school? Parent-teacher association, whatever. Your data protection is now an important health and safety issue, particularly in some sectors and jobs. Okay, I feel like I'm stating the obvious when I say this. Employers have a legal duty to protect the health and safety of workers at work. Health and safety includes both physical and mental health. It includes protecting workers from harm from psychosocial risk factors. That includes work-related stress, third-party violence, bullying, harassments, call it what you wish. And this also includes online, cyber, or virtual, pick your name, pick your term, at work. The challenge, of course, here is the at work bit becomes a little bit more vague and challenging, as the previous speakers highlighted. Not everybody is affected the same. It's not the same for me as opposed to let's say, a migrant worker who's a young lady. There are variations by sector, there are variations by job, there are variations by your demographic differences in the population. Gender is a huge dimension, and we have to accept that. And when we're doing prevention, we have to say it's not the same for everybody. We've got to have targeted and specific risk assessments, identifying the workers most at risk. We call for this when we're dealing with prevention anyway. If you think about cleaning workers who may be workers who are working alone, working at night, working handling cash, whatever it is, we expect specific risk assessment actions and prevention actions for specific workers, and it's exactly the same here. So it is a health and safety issue. Having said that, it is often not only a health and safety issue. But just because the issue may fall under other legislation, whether it's criminal or whatever, doesn't stop it falling under health and safety legislation. And one thing in some countries and some legal system we see is that if you want to call it criminal law, focuses on the perpetrator, the individual. Occupational safety and health law takes a different approach. It says the employer has a duty to protect the workers at work, and this has to be a systemic approach to prevention. We have to build the OSH culture. We have to put in the systems, the trainings, the approaches to prevent harm to the workers. So in those two different ways, you have slightly different focuses on the prevention approach. And we can use health and safety legislation and health and safety at work to develop a positive workplace culture. I add in here at the bottom, and I'll come back to this a little bit, we can't be very narrow when we're looking about legal approaches to prevention in health and safety at work. Just as nowadays we say, yes, here is what the OSH legislation says, and maybe quite specific guidance on this, there are many issues surrounding that. Wellness, for example, many companies do smoking cessation policies, good healthy eating policies and promotion things around, which may not fit into the health and safety law box, but complement and support health and safety at work. And this can be also applied to psychosocial risks, including online violence and harassment. If we want to be more specific, when we talk about prevention, it has to be holistic, it has to be systemic, it has to be systematic, and it has to be coherent when we're looking at your data protection activities, your harassment policies, your equality policies, your telework policies, and everything else. Your risk assessment has to be up to date, and it should explicitly address psychosocial risks, including issues such as third-party violence and harassment, and taking into account the modern working environment. There should be an easy to access reporting system for violence and harassment. How often do you see that the reporting system, you have to go and fill in 3 forms and go and see your manager to report any approach, or go and visit this workplace, or go and see this person in particular? Why? If violence and harassment can be done online, why isn't a simple reporting system online, for example? You have to be engaging with dialogue with the workers and other stakeholders, depending on your context. What about parent-teachers associations, patient groups, the police, other enforcing authorities? You've got to give repeated information, instruction, and training, especially to supervisors and managers. And I would stress they're repeated. If you'd have one seminar which is optional to attend on harassment, that's not good enough. You have to be doing repeated mandatory training on issues like harassment, bullying, violence prevention. We want proactive interventions as well as post-incident procedures. You have to do your best to prevent something happening, but you should have a good system in place if it has happened. And as I said, look for other well-being promotions, approaches, including mental health supporting activities. Now, one thing I'd highlight here is that this is almost like a confession we should make, is that health and safety at work has a reporting issue. Is in many systems, accidents and ill health, especially ill health, is underreported. Now, this does vary between the social insurance systems around. Finland's, for example, is an excellent reporting system. Other countries, which I'll not name, have much less reporting, maybe 30% or less of accidents being reported, and ill health, especially ones which have long latency, the reporting is much worse. Sometimes we see that third-party violence or harassment is not reported because it's seen as part of the job. Internal harassment is not reported because of this power imbalance between the perpetrator and the victim. The victim is reluctant to speak out because they're afraid of losing their job, for example. Especially if it's a senior figure in your organization. What we need to be having is an action to lower the bar so that people can talk about these issues. To give one example here, what we're doing in EU OSHA, we have an informal procedure with confidential counsellors. This is a process within the EU. There are a lot of institutions that have procedures like this. And what we do is twofold. The first of which is it allows this informal procedure to go on, which is an option, not instead of, but an option as well as formal reporting and complaints procedures under the staff regulations of European institutions. But we also do a lot of promotional activities. We go to our staff meetings and say, if you need to talk, if you're not sure it is a problem, come and talk to us. We're available. This is the information. This is what harassment is. This is what sexual harassment is. So we need to lower the bar and raise the profile of third-party violence and harassment, especially sexual harassment. There are ways of getting a good picture. For example, workplace surveys is always a good one. But there are many, many challenges when you're running a workplace survey on this topic. I mean, the first point is, what are you going to do when you get the results? If the results come back and they're horrendous, what are you going to do about it? Because having asked the question, if you do nothing with the answers, in many ways, that's worse than not asking the question in the first place. And as I say here, reports must always be followed up and the victim kept informed. Because if you don't do that, your system is discredited almost from the first moment. Now, there are digital solutions to these digital risks. And as was mentioned earlier in previous seminar, online risk assessment tools can and do include harassment and third-party violence dimensions, and they can include digital third-party harassment issues. There are web training packages and programs available for workers and employers. We came up with we found one from Sweden, which was social partner driven, and it was about prevention of violence, physical violence in the small shop sector, and it fitted in a broader police program on prevention of violence. So there was training for workers and employers what to do and how to reduce the risk of robbery in small shops, for example. And this tailored in with a police program. As I mentioned earlier, you can have online third-party violence and harassment reporting, so it's easy to report. And you can also have online counselling for workers who have suffered violence or harassment. And this actually can work well, and it is because some people are very nervous about talking about this face-to-face. Actually, the distance of online counselling can be beneficial sometimes. So there are digital prevention methods out there to address these digital issues. There are challenges to prevention. As I mentioned earlier, there's this bullying, this blurring of boundaries between work and life, and in legislative approaches, it's the protection of workers at work. And this can be quite challenging as an OSH issue. If somebody, I'm a teacher and I'm being bullied outside of school online, how can this be picked up, and how does the legislation work? I mentioned the underreporting, and we see always this lagging behind of legislation, policy and compliance, lagging behind the technology. We've seen it, for example, with platform work. We're now working towards the issue of what is the legal status of a platform worker, and also with this, the legislation, policy and compliance actions do have to catch up. Maybe in the workplace, the biggest challenge to prevention is that it is not being seen as a problem. And there has to be leadership on this. Management and managers have to be brave and say, okay, let's open the box. What is the situation in our workplace? And it's wonderful that in this social partner initiative here, you have employers here as much as the workers here, because these are the employers showing leadership. But unfortunately, in other sectors, maybe in other industries, in other workplaces, that leadership isn't there. And the first thing the leaders have to do is engage and talk to the workers. I would say it's not all bad. And it's, for me, it's a little strange because I've been at the agency since 1999. And when we were first here, we started working on work-related stress. And then there was this ongoing dialogue, what is work-related stress? Is there such a thing as work-related stress? And now we're at the stage of saying everybody recognizes that work-related stress is an issue. And the question is, how exactly do we deal with it? And I feel we're a bit in the same situation here with this topic as we were with stress then, in that we're maybe searching a bit for definitions, we're searching a bit for legislative and policy frameworks. But we are seeing that mental health is increasingly seen as a work issue. It's in the new OSH strategy. The digital Europe is the new normal. Its change has happened. We are here now, and we know we have a digital Europe. The pandemic, I think, has accelerated this. There's increasing recognition of the need for compliance action on third-party violence and harassment by labour inspectorates. They have published guidance. The Senior Labour Inspectors Committee have published guidance for inspectors on psychosocial risks, including these topics. Although I would say there that the online issues are still not very visible, but we are seeing movement on this. And I think also at the societal level, we are seeing that cyberbullying and harassment is being seen as an issue, and it is perhaps being taken more seriously. And the fact that it's being debated in the European Parliament and issues like this is a positive sign. So I'll stop there. I'll be delighted to answer any questions, and please, I look forward to hearing from you. Thank you very much.
Many thanks, Tim. It was extremely interesting and useful to remind us of the different policy pointers, and some of which do relate to what also Matthias said. I'm always struck by the fact that some people, employers or maybe employees actually would think that it's part of the job, that violence or abuse can be part of the job. And that I think is really a frame of mind that needs to be totally challenged. I'm conscious of time, and I would like to ask, I know that Martina, you have to leave before 12 o'clock, and I was wondering whether, Aline, you would mind if we take Martina's presentation first, okay, so that if we have questions to ask Martina, that can be done before 12 o'clock. And Tim, I'm sure that there will be also questions regarding your excellent presentation, but I suggest we move on because of time pressure. But we'll come back to it after Martina and Aline. Martina, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Nadia, and thank you, Aline, for accepting. I would say that more than a presentation, this would be more an update.
Yeah.
Yesterday, as you already mentioned, we had the plenary meeting of the European Sectoral Social Dialogue in Education, and I wanted to update you on a couple of relevant outcomes that we have adopted in that forum. And in particular, I refer to a joint statement that was adopted as an outcome of a social dialogue project that was addressing the challenges and opportunities of digitalization in the education sector. And we adopted a comprehensive statement of 9 points. And one of these points indeed relates to the challenges, the OSH challenges that digitalization is posing today. And therefore, as social partner in education, we have committed yesterday to enhance cooperation on the topic. One of the key findings of this project was indeed that all activities regarding digitalization and the link with OSH are only developed by social partners on their own. So either only employers or only trade unions. So there is a lack of cooperation on joint initiative on the topic. That's why for the next year, we would like to increase the activities that we are doing on the topic, but more concretely, we would like to update our existing OIRA tools, and I'm very happy that also EU OSHA is with us today because we have done an incredible work of cooperation with them to develop these tools. The project indeed addressed also emergency remote teaching during the pandemic, so we can expect a new normal that will be more and more digitalized. And what our members have reported is the existing OIRA tools indeed are not adequately fit to meet the challenges in terms of occupational health and safety, including third-party violence, cyberbullying, but there's also a matter of the right to disconnect, for instance, in the education sector, of teachers 24 hours being exposed to the contact with parents and students. So we are committed to concretely update the risk assessment tools we have developed, and I'm happy also to announce you that yesterday we also adopted another statement that was the outcome of the joint project on promoting online risk assessment in the education sector. And indeed, the findings of the two projects are indeed the same with regards of digitalization challenges. My last point, it's also on the joint work program that we adopted as social partners in education, because there was a clear demand from our members for the next 2 years to focus on how can we support the implementation of indeed the cross-sectoral framework agreement on digitalization. So this directly links with the next presentation of Aline as well. So we will definitely also reach out to EQC so that I know that also the Confederation is working on implementing the agreement. So we will work on the implementation of the agreement in the education sector. And that's all from my side. I will be here until 12, and I will put a couple of links in the chat so that you can have access to these documents as well. Thanks.
Many thanks, Martina, and well done. Good way of concluding the year 2020, which has been particularly difficult. Indeed, the reports, the presentations of today's webinar will be sent to all participants, and there will be a report with the links to statements or recent initiatives taken, as we'll hear probably furthermore. So, well, it gives us a good transition to our last intervention, which is really to remind us of that important framework, autonomous cross-sectoral agreement on digitalization, which was adopted last year. And some of us in different sectors are indeed looking at ways of implementing or building upon the agreement in our own sector. We had the example of education. And if I just say that in central governments, we are about to hopefully finalize a new agreement on digitalization, which might, well, I believe will actually provide for a number of things we have already said, recognition of the need to prevent violence, harassment, any types of violence, but including also cyber violence and including domestic violence. I'm glad to say that the employers have agreed to have a tiny reference to it. This was a bit of a sticking point, but we managed to get in the text, so which should be finalized in the next months or so. So, and I believe maybe many other sectors are also busy. So we'll hear from Aline, perhaps a bit more about that specific provision on violence, who initiated it, whether it was the trade union side, if you know. I mean, I don't want to put you on the spot. I don't know if you took part in the negotiations, but whether it was a demand from the trade unions, how did the employers react? And more so now on the implementation and indeed, yes, the ILO 190, that you are a policy officer charged with gender equality, amongst many other things, multitasking being the norm in many union organizations. So Aline, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Nadia, for this introduction, and thank you for the intervention also specifically to EBSU and all the project partners. I will briefly share my screen since I have prepared a little presentation. This should work. Okay. So yeah, you spoke already on it, Nadia, but maybe let me start by briefly speaking about the framework agreement on harassment and violence, dated from 2007. So it's been a while. I think we can all agree to that. And the objectives were to increase the awareness and understanding of employers, workers, and their representatives of workplace harassment and violence, and to provide employers, workers, and their representatives at all levels with an action-oriented framework to identify, prevent, and manage problems of harassment and violence at work. So really an action-oriented framework to prevent and to identify and manage problems of harassment and violence. So that's one piece of the puzzle, actually. And the second one would be, and you mentioned it, the framework agreement on digitalization that is dated from last year, actually. So I believe the implementation is very much ongoing. And we have here, I copy-pasted sort of a relevant paragraph out of the agreement that, for example, also speaks on relations with clients and other third parties, and says specifically that it's important to take into account the quality of relations. So in brackets, the collaboration, integration, contact moments and possibilities, communication, work atmosphere, the management style, and the occurrence of violence and harassment, conflict management, and support procedures and mechanisms. So this is the reference here that we have in the framework agreement on digitalization on violence and harassment, which is obviously, I think there is room for improvement, also to specifically say on a gender responsive approach that this reference here has in the digitalization framework agreement. And as said, it's very much it's very much being implemented as of now, and it's done jointly by national affiliates, so by the trade union side and the employers. So this is what I can say maybe briefly on this agreement. And unfortunately, I can't spoiler anything also, but violence and harassment specifically in the digitalized world of work is indeed also a priority from the ETUC in the ongoing negotiations of the social work program and the program pertains to next year until the year 2024. So as said, the negotiations here are ongoing, and I can obviously, I'm very sorry, but I cannot share any details of it yet. So I can't give too many spoilers, but just to say that this is very much on our mind also to integrate this in the next social dialogue work program. Maybe if I may, I would conclude, and it's a very brief presentation I have prepared, but I would also like to conclude with specifically ETUC actions. So now I'm specifically speaking with my ETUC head as advisor on gender equality. And I was very interested to hear also about the survey that you are conducting in the framework of this project. Just to say that the ETUC has conducted maybe a less comprehensive survey, and a survey that is not targeted to third-party violence. However, in the beginning of this year, we have consulted our affiliates, and specifically our affiliates from the Women's Committee, from the ETUC Women's Committee, to give us actually an update on violence and harassment. So, and the findings are listed here on this slide. So we have a large majority that say that employers have not updated their policies to address online harassment associated with telework. So there's room for improvement here on the employers' reaction, specifically with obviously many people working in telework arrangements due to the COVID pandemic. Also, a large majority of our affiliates pointed out that employers were not doing enough to tackle violence and harassment at work, including online. 84% thought that their national laws were not strong enough to tackle violence and harassment at work. And 83% believed that their country's laws to tackle violence and harassment at work, including online, were not adequately enforced. And a very large majority of respondents were generally very concerned about violence and harassment at work, online and offline, specifically in the context of the COVID pandemic. And we have also seen many comments pointing out to third-party violence and harassment, specifically, for example, for workers who are bound to enforce sort of sanitary COVID rules, for example, clients that have to wear a mask or situations of the like that are increasingly really exposed to third-party violence and harassment. So aggressive clients, for example, that is something we are very much aware of. And we believe that the ILO Convention 190 is a very, very good instrument to actually tackle violence and harassment in the world of work. The title says it, in the world of work is a very, very broad definition that is very timely also when it comes to digitalized workspaces, but as well, and I think the previous speakers mentioned that briefly, so world of work in the sense that if I work maybe from home online, if I'm on the way to work, if I'm commuting, so this is all covered in by the ILO Convention 190, which is why the ETUC is very actively pushing for member states to ratify this convention. I can maybe briefly speak on the state of play here, which is actually, I would say, rather positive, because we have Italy and Greece that have ratified the convention this summer. So Greece was, I believe, Greece was in August and Italy was in October. Knowing that we have a bit of a legal or an alleged legal uncertainty here at EU level, since there is still a council decision pending, actually, that has not been approved by the council, and that's the council decision authorizing member states to ratify the ILO Convention 190. The ETUC believes actually that this is adding additional barriers for member states to do so, and that there is no authorization from the side of the EU Council necessary for member states to be able to ratify the ILO Convention 190, because if a member state is an ILO member, they know what to do, and the ILO has themselves the procedure sort of laid out, so there is no need for a council authorization. However, this document is still pending in the council. It's been recently a bit tangled up with the Istanbul Convention, which is obviously the one thing you do not want to be tangled up with, because the whole process around the Istanbul Convention is extremely complex. However, we have quite high hopes for the French presidency to unblock actually this council decision. So first step, we still call on member states, and we think that member states are completely able to ratify this ILO convention without the council authorizing it. However, since we know that many member states are waiting for this council decision to be unblocked and to rather have sort of a common EU approach on this issue, we do have hopes on the French presidency to unblock this council decision and this pending file, specifically because France has actually completed internally the most important steps towards ratification of the ILO convention. So it's through the Assemblée Nationale and through the Senate. The process is more or less completed. However, I believe maybe France won't go forward themselves now with a pending council decision. So we really have hopes here that they use also the presidency to unblock this file and this decision, and that then many more countries are following. Maybe a short update also, the Netherlands and Belgium are also very, very close to ratifying, and here the internal process at member state level sort of is completed. And I believe the same goes also for Finland. Yeah, maybe just very quickly, because recently we celebrated the 25th of November. That is not a day for celebration, so the International Day for Eradication of all forms of gender-based violence and violence against women. So here we did a little action sort of also and called again on member states to ratify ILO Convention 190, and also on affiliates to keep up the pressure, because we have momentum here sort of with Greece and Italy moving forward on this issue, and to really capitalize from this, and to increase the pressure and make member states basically ratify the convention. In addition, I will very, very briefly speak on 2 additional aspects, because we have recently responded sort of to the Slovenian presidency, who have, so that there were council conclusions adopted at the last EBSCO meeting on the 6th of December on the impact of artificial intelligence on gender equality in the labor market, which sort of is linked to the topic here of this webinar, in the sense that we believe that it's of utmost importance actually to make sure that the gender bias in artificial intelligence is corrected and properly addressed. And we do fear that also our solutions based on AI are actually used also for surveilling employees without their consent and without the involvement of their union, and without them knowing actually that this is happening, which is obviously a massive intrusion in the fundamental rights of workers, and can qualify maybe as violence and harassment, or can be discussed in the scope of that discussion as well. And a last point I would like to raise is actually from this week, because the European Parliament has adopted a resolution on combating gender-based cyber violence. The text, there's a committee report from the FAM and the LIBE committee that was voted in the Parliament on Tuesday. So an adopted resolution calling the European Commission to step up the fight against cyber violence. And just to say that the report is very comprehensive, and that it's great that, for example, the definition of cyber violence, cyber harassment and the likes is really included there. And we fully share the assessment that the European institutions, specifically the Commission, has to react on this issue. However, we identified that the workplace in this resolution is a complete blind spot. So there is no mentioning of social partners. There is no mentioning of social dialogue. There's no mentioning of collective bargaining. So a lot of different actors are actually mentioned who can be very instrumental in preventing cyber violence, for example, but the workplace and specifically, obviously, trade unions are failed to being acknowledged here as relevant actors, and specifically also the most important tool, which is collective bargaining, that can play a crucial role here, is disregarded, and that's quite regrettable. However, as one positive note, the rapporteurs here have made the link to economic violence, which is obviously correct and positive, in the sense that survivors and victims of cyber violence are very much affected also in their capacity to participate in the labor market, to feel safe at work, to be actually able to work. So just the link between cyber violence and economic violence, I think, is quite important, and that was correctly identified in this report. However, and that leads me maybe to my very last point. So the upcoming directive from the European Commission to prevent and combat specific forms of gender-based violence, that was postponed. It's now to be expected, I believe, in March next year. And also the same message to the Commission, and I believe there was a Commission representative also in the last webinar here you've had, so a strong workplace dimension, and to correctly identify what social partners can actually do on these issues, and that's not nothing. That's of real value, and that's very essential. And we also need the Commission to understand that, and to include strong workplace dimension in the upcoming proposal. And the ETUC is lobbying still to make this happen. We still have a bit of time left, so let's make use of it. That would be it from my side. I'll stop sharing my screen. Thanks for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Aline, and all the more grateful we are, given you've been asked to step in and replace another colleague. So it was an off-the-cuff intervention. And I would like also to say, because we have employers, organizations with us, that we did ask SGI Europe to also take part in the intervention on the cross-sectoral agreement on digitalization, but they were not available. So thanks for that. The ETUC survey, I think, will be very also interesting to share with the participants. And I think the point on artificial intelligence and gender equality has not yet been raised in the discussion today. And yet, I mean, as I was mentioning this agreement on digitalization and other initiatives, there is this the gender bias or ethnic bias in algorithm, which is now becoming much more aware of that. And that leads me to in terms of, violence, physical violence, verbal abuse, cyber violence, economic violence. There is also symbolic violence and how the institutions repeat the same discrimination. So we need also to watch that space in relation to indeed algorithm. Anyway, I stopped talking because now it's 10 to 12 and we are a bit behind schedule. But what I would like to check first is whether the speakers can stay with us at least for another 10 minutes. Yes, Matthias, Tim, Aline. Brilliant, thanks. So what I would like to do now is to pass on the floor to the delegates for questions regarding the presentations we just had in terms of is there anything new? Did you learn something, or do you agree? It's important to also express if you agree that yes, indeed, this is violence is underreported, cyber violence is like that, but also perhaps to share with us what you've been doing or what are the obstacles to doing more, or anything you want really, because the floor is now to the participants. And I'm checking if there are any yellow hands. Someone has got to break the ice, kindly, non-violently. Yep. Okay, yeah, I see someone waving there. That's Ettore Micheladze. If you can introduce yourself and the organization you're from. Thank you.
Sì, buongiorno a tutti. Ettore Micheladze dal sindacato ANIEF da
Trade Union, CISAL, which is part of CESI, and thank you for your invitation. I'm very grateful. That was very interesting and inspiring to me. I think that this is still a worrying issue, especially in Italy. One of the issues that I can highlight as a trade unionist, when we have claims about violence and harassment, cyberbullying actions or whatever, we have issues because the victims do not dare talking about that or complaining about these issues and phenomena to the official authorities. I think that there is a lot of work to be done, and as teachers, I think especially teachers and female colleagues, women who are victims of violence from parents and men, and we are really experiencing a lot of problems. There is a lot to be done. Goodwill is lacking, and I think that it is important to go on with these webinars and meetings at national but also local level, because something is lacking. I really can perceive that in Italy. I am based in Trieste, and there is a lack of recognition. This problem seems not to exist somehow. Thank you for giving me the floor.
Yeah, it's well, thanks for this. It's interesting because indeed, as was said by Tim Tregenza, that there is, and that's perhaps that was the positive thing, that there is increasing awareness and recognition of the problem. But you're saying indeed that that's still little awareness at the workplace. I don't know if any of the speakers want to react to what Ettore said, and I think deep down is also perhaps would it be part of the employer's duty to, and possibly the trade unions, to encourage a culture of trust and to encourage people to report when they feel they've been abused, and to reiterate that this is, that shouldn't take place at the workplace. But is there a specific, would you see that as a part of the employer's duty to care, to create that culture? Tim?
I see two dimensions here. One is that there is an obligation on employers to provide basically information, instruction, training and supervision to the workers on health and safety issues. So that's a very, if you like, legalistic, mechanical approach that can be taken. You are a worker. This is an issue of health and safety of workers. Therefore, we are training you. Okay, that's one way of doing it, and that's one approach that can work. And maybe it has to be in the first place. But you have to go beyond that, I think. You have to be engaging with the workers, because quite often bullying, harassment, even violence can come from your peers, not just from your managers or somebody outside the organization. There has to be a dialogue between the workers and the employers, managers. And we see, for example, in the healthcare sector, they sometimes have things called health circles. And this is an approach that has been used on many health and safety issues, including manual handling and stress. And these are situations where you get work teams in, the supervisor and the workers and an expert, an OSH professional perhaps, and to talk around and through an issue at work. And in this way, you engage for dialogue, you have the expert steering, and you can approach practical solutions that are tailored to that workplace or that work team. And this is one way that can go forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So yeah, to reach out to workers. And indeed, I thought that was the point made by Matthias, that well, based on previous research from Eurofound, and is that, and as part of our work on specifically on external violence, so on third-party violence, one of the key findings was that the incidence of violence was more often coming from outside, from the users, customers. But here, Matthias, you actually said, well, according to the data available, and again, it's very, very difficult and it would take more research, but you were saying that in terms, for cyber violence, that was more likely to come from employees or even trainees, you mentioned, or management, but it was internal. Perpetrators were from the organization or working closely with the organization. So different from, earlier findings we would have on violence in general or harassment. Don't know if you want to expand on that. And meanwhile, if anyone else would like to take the floor, please do so. So it will be John next, but first, maybe Matthias, if you want to react to that.
Yeah, well, about the matter of perpetrators, it was surprising to ourselves, but I think it might have a lot to do with how bullying is defined and the fact that it needs to be repeated, and therefore it's more prominent in situations where repetition is easy to occur, namely internal between people that come across each other once in a while, and not between external customers and clients who might obviously make a cyber threat, for instance, but they don't engage in bullying because that threat is only issued once. But generally, I have the impression that at least under the law, most of the legislation is focused on internal bullying as well, at least what we saw. And so the occurrence of third-party violence is pretty different in certain respects. And I think it is something that has been given less attention, at least high up the chain and by legislators, than internal bullying has so far. So I think it's probably right for you to focus on this kind of angle, and that it deserves more attention compared to most forms of internal bullying that have so far been researched as well the most.
Yeah, thanks. John McGaban, please, if you can also mention which organization you're from. Thank you.
Yes, thanks very much, Nadia. John McGahan, I'm representing the Teachers Union of Ireland. So we represent teachers at post-primary level in further and adult education and lecturers in higher education institutions. It's an observation, and it doesn't really address the issue, quite frankly, of third-party violence. But it seems to me that prior to arriving in the workplace, particularly in regulated professions, such as teaching, and it extends way beyond teaching, there is insufficient attention paid in preparatory programs to both the responsibilities and the rights that one has in relation to the prevention of violence and protection against violence. And it again, this is entirely anecdotal, but perhaps amplified during the time of since COVID struck, we have seen increasing evidence that young teachers have emerged from pretty extensive and very professionalized teacher training programs between 4 and 6 years duration generally, have arrived in classrooms, have tended not to understand when arriving in classrooms or arriving in schools that the level of social media interaction that they previously would have had with their non-teaching peers, with, if you like, younger friends, is perhaps no longer possible. And quite a number of these teachers have found themselves in situations which they would accurately describe as situations involving harassment and bullying without quite knowing how they got there. They find themselves in a maelstrom without realizing that they were heading there. And it seems to me that it is, if you like, now a fundamental deficit in teacher training programs. I can only speak specifically about those, but probably also in other professional training programs, that there isn't not just a module, but an inherent cultural strain running through those programs that would address violence. The other thing that strikes me is that in some of the professional programs, or in programs that are regulated by professional bodies, codes of professional conduct, which do have more than moral authority, could be bolstered by the inclusion very explicitly of the appropriate sort of language around the issue of harassment, bullying, and third-party violence. But they also could include, because quite a number of the people who undertake these programs end up in senior management positions on the right side of power imbalances, if you like. And it would be, I think, useful if professional codes could include something explicitly advising that transgressing in terms of, if you like, inappropriately using that power is something that will result in removal from the register of the regulatory body, or could at least involve removal from the register of the regulatory body, so that this becomes culturally the norm across particular professions. Now, I do realize I'm speaking about a very specific set of occupations, and my apologies for that, but I do think there's a deficit there that can be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, John. Indeed, very important in terms of prior training, and to be made aware, and to be trying to be a bit equipped with risk of violence at work. Obviously, we would like to prevent violence from taking place in the first place, but how to better train and to make students, professional students, aware of it. Matthias, Tim, or Aline, would you like to add something to what John said? Or I saw in the chat, Tim, that you sent an OSHA guide regarding the teaching sector.
Yes, just to respond to John briefly, I put in the link. It's a fairly old report we did on what we term mainstreaming occupational safety and health into teacher training. This is a bit old, and I'm not sure how much it covers on psychosocial issues in general. But we talk about a life course approach to occupational safety and health that starts before entering the workforce, going through your different needs and your different challenges all the way through to retirement. And you have to adapt your OSH prevention approaches to the position of a person in their life course. Yeah, obviously a young person has different risk perception to an older person. An older person can't responds differently and learns differently to so that's one of the things I'd say, is that this has always got to be the case. And how you deal with older workers who are potentially behaving in these situations is different to a younger person who may be more tech savvy. That's the first point I'd make. Second one is, traditionally we've talked about the differential between third-party violence and bullying being external and internal. And when it was on the ground, if you like, that wasn't so difficult, because you'd say the third-party violence is when you're being threatened or whatever in a school, in the transport sector, in hospitals, and bullying was something else totally internal. Those lines are blurring. Because of how work organization is, but also with the digital dimension. You have contractors, you have people who, well, they may be in, but they're not in. Contractors working on site, for example, they're not employees, but they're within the same work ecosystem, if you like. And the last point I'd make here is that on the issue of repetition, under the EU staff regulations, it differentiates between sexual harassment and psychological harassment. Psychological harassment has to be repeated. Sexual harassment can be a one-off incident. And this is maybe something that can be highlighted. A lot of this online threats, violence, harassment against women, once is enough. And maybe this needs to be a focus when we're looking at these issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Actually, I think the ILO Convention 190 also defines gender-based harassment as a one-off incident. So that notion of repetition is actually not there. So, but it's something I think we'll probably have to come back to regarding, what we need to avoid also multiplication of different definitions, which will bring more confusion to employers to some extent, and trade unions and workers. But I think we will need, as part of the project, also to come back to that indeed. So thanks for this clarification between sexual harassment and psychological harassment, at least in the EU staff regulations. Carolina, please.
Hola de nuevo a todos y todas. Muchísimas gracias por...
Hi. Again, thanks for your presentations that were very interesting, and the specifications that you have just made are really useful. I come from Comisiones Obreras, Services to Citizens. I am working on the general administration of the state. As Nadia knows, we are participating at the social dialogue at the European Union. We are working on the digitalization rules and regulations in Spain. The general administration, I have the text here with me. We are going to publish a royal decree to apply the telework for public servants. And this royal decree, we will have to look at the details, because we wanted to respect the agreement that we reached a few months ago. It was on minimum conditions. And for me, one of the main problems, this agreement that is going to become a royal decree, is how to protect occupational health and risk prevention. And this, the thing that we are talking about today, it is a risk and it is not being included in this regulation that we will have in Spain. For us, this is a very big concern. This situation in this royal decree, we are talking about health, we are talking about harassment, we are talking about different situations of psychosocial risks, but at the end, it is the worker who has to decide what to do. And we are talking about a situation that could be harassment. We are talking about something that is more difficult to communicate. We have nobody has seen it, but the regulation in our country, we don't know whether it is going to include this. And what you were talking, the gender issue is a big concern to us. I am going to share something with you. We have in our public administration in Spain, we have an agreement that is from the 8th of August 2011. It is a protocol to face sexual harassment in our public administration, and to apply this, we need a royal decree. Today, 11 years later, we do not have this royal decree that implements this. The government says that these are issues that have to be solved at a domestic level, and well, we are concerned about this, and with telework and with digitalizations, with all the means that we are using in Spain, we are worried because we believe that we won't see any prevention on occupational health, harassment, violence, and gender violence. Therefore, in our social dialogue and following this agreement that we want to reach in our social dialogue committee, we hope that we will be able to solve this in Spain. Thank you very much.
Okay, thanks, Carolina, and we wish you all the best with that. And indeed, to many speakers, and I think that will be also important in our discussion, is whether we need also new legislation, new legislative tools, new collective agreements, but also at the same time to enforce existing protection. And it's finding the right balance between the two. Are there any other comments from Aline, Tim, or Matthias following what Carolina said? Yes, Aline?
Maybe if I may, one general comment, because I think the question on definitions is quite interesting, and you raised it, Nadia, like you can't overburden people with too many definitions on what that actually is. But I would argue also that, and that was, I think, a part of Tim's presentation also, that many forms of violence are actually extremely normalized, specifically gender-based violence. So it's happening, it's normal, it's part of my job. So I believe to make people and like workers and employers alike aware of what actually constitutes violence, and specifically in the digital world, is a very first important step to make this comprehensive and clear. That would be a remark from my side. Thanks.
No, absolutely, and then not to be put in boxes of concept or definitions, and then nothing happens. So, but yeah, I think definition on violence, gender-based violence, is the key thing. Right. Are there any other delegates who would like to ask our speakers questions? And if not, I will set them free, because they've already spent a long time with us, and I think we can be really, very much grateful to their time, for their times. Carolina, your hand is still on the screen, but I believe that's because you didn't remove it. Yeah, okay. Right, I don't see anyone else. No. And sorry, but we now have to rush a bit. So I'd like to thank again, Tim and Matthias and Aline and Martina, who just left, And we will certainly come back to you and use your findings. It was extremely useful. And we will still be obviously work with the ETUC regarding what we're going to do with our guidelines on external violence and whether we will update them, and if so, how. And I think it will tie in very nicely. And I don't want you to force you to divulge, the latest on the negotiations of the work plan. But if there is also discussion on revising the EU agreement, the EU cross-sectoral agreement on harassment and violence, obviously, then we will really need to talk to make sure that we synchronize the discussions and that we complement each other and not to contradict each other. So that will be extremely also important. Thanks a lot again, and hope we can. We will meet again and. Thanks again for your participation. Now we've got 10 minutes left. So obviously the discussion on the guidelines, and I feel that we have all reached a Zoom fatigue exponentially now. So, but the idea was to discuss based on the presentations, the interventions, whether and how to update the guidelines, which do provide, which do recognize, I'm talking about our guidelines, multi-sectoral social dialogue guidelines on the prevention of third-party violence and harassment at work. And if you have any, based on the discussions, I think we were given the advice, and that's where I think our project is really on the right track to review our policies. So there is no doubt that what we are doing is certainly important, but based on what we heard on cyber violence, and I thought, again, as a continuation or as part of a cycle of violence, so offline violence was important, and Team's latest comments that the boundaries between work life and private life are becoming so blurred that, and that also is reflected, in the differences between what we thought perhaps was neat differences between external violence, so from users, customers, and internal violence coming from colleagues, management. And then we have obviously the whole chain of, subcontractors and the public services use and more contractors. So how do we position ourselves on that? I'm not expecting an answer today, but I thought that was also a question we need to ask ourselves, whether we update our guidelines or whether our guidelines on third-party violence might be integrated into a broader agreements on violence, which is why I asked the ETUC the question on the revision of the agreement on violence and harassment. But you might have much more, down to the ground questions or reflections on the use of the guidelines. Right, I see. I mean, the issue of domestic violence is certainly also an important one, which we'll keep in mind, not least also in view of the pending gender-based violence directive. Right, I see perhaps it's a bit too much to end the meeting. It's, if I give my personal view, it's, I mean, again, this is the 4th webinar, and I do think that there is scope for, looking into the content of the guidelines. And we will, in any case, come back to you and have further discussions in the steering group of the project to see how best to tackle that and make sure that, it is relevant to you and your members. Right. Okay, well, if there are no further comments, no point in pushing it. Oh, yes, Paola. Hi, Paola, my dear colleague. Come in, please.
Hi, thank you very much. It was really interesting listening to the presentations. I just wanted to report back very briefly from the seminar we hold with the local and regional government on third-party violence. Leonardo is not here, but just very briefly, Dominique is here and was one of the co-organizers from CGT. What the local and regional government sector said is indeed that these guidelines would need some update, an update that would go in terms of wording, aligning, so taking into account the word, I'd say a refresh of the language where needed, thinking, for example, taking into account the international instruments, the United Nations Convention on Persons with Disabilities, but also the ILO 190, the Istanbul Convention, so a number of instruments that were not there when these guidelines were first drafted and signed. The other element that the local and regional government sector agreed on was the necessity to include indeed the digitalization and online violence. So those items for our sector were very important, and we discussed them specifically for the professions in our sectors, both for front desk workers, which is also the subgroup that we decided to include in this project, but also for other professions, firefighters, municipal police, social workers, and so forth. Those are really important points. So definitely from our sector, there is an interest in updating and revising the guidelines. Just wanted to report that from our sector. Thank you.
Many thanks, Paola. It's extremely useful to know coming from the local regional government. Is there anyone else who would like to comment, even a broad view on whether there would be a need to update the 11 years old guidelines? I'm checking the chat also. If you bear with me a second. No, it was about Paola. So. Okay, no further comments. Okay, well, I think that's been, again, very full, lots of information today. As I said, you will receive the report of today's webinar and the presentations. I think that was many interesting things to be said. On the role of trade unions and employers, I think we will probably have also to come back to that, but also to this, again, idea which I keep on hammering through, is a collective, how to keep the collective going, which is even more of a challenge when you meet your colleagues only online, and the extent to which, again, not meeting your colleagues or can also fuel frustrations and make the work much more difficult. But more globally, the absence of collective support, and obviously that's a key role of the trade unions, also probably plays a big role in a more volatile or even violent atmosphere, or conducive, or atmosphere conducive to violence or abuse. And that collective strength, collective support is, in my view, also very, very important to look into. Okay, well, we've got 5 more minutes, but if we can close perhaps earlier than planned. I would like to thank the speakers again. I would like to thank you, the participants, because again, it's been extremely busy. And to have yet another online meeting to attend is not perhaps so, so easy. So thanks for your time, for your active listening. And I would like also to thank more particularly Marcella from CESI, who helped to organize this meeting, contacting the speakers, and it has been very much appreciated. And of course, to thank the interpreters. In terms of the next steps, I would like to say that we are supposed to have our first conference January or February in Madrid, but in light of the pandemic, which sadly continues to be with us, this is not going to happen. And our idea is that to have a conference, this is important, obviously, for sharing information, but also for networking, meeting people in person. So we are looking at alternatives to that. But you can really pencil down that probably the only conference of the project will take place in 1 year time, 25th of November, 2022, where we will obviously put together the research findings and have proposals on the review, if necessary, of our guidelines. And of course, we will invite all the speakers who took part, the experts who took part in the webinars, of course, if they are available. So 25/11/22. Meanwhile, we have 3 more webinars to go, one of which will probably take place in February, and which will focus on the compensation of victims of violence, which will take us again also in terms of social insurance, liability of the employers. And I keep in mind teams, or was it Matthias, sorry, to look at also, and no employers reacted to that, but looking into the employer of the perpetrator. You know, what is this chain of responsibilities, liabilities? So it's probably something we will come back to at that seminar. And again, I think we can't stress enough the importance of supporting those victims and encouraging reporting, because again, today it was confirmed that there is still a lot of underreporting. It's still a taboo, and yet it shouldn't be the case. And the more we talk about it, the more so it's likely that we will succeed in eradicating it. So that will be for the next webinar. And then we will also have another webinar with the sectoral specifics. So we'll keep you posted on how we are going to put together the different sectors. So bear with us. And that's it. So I cannot share dates with you. I'm sorry. We will send you an email. But as I said, probably in February, there will be at least one webinar. That's it from my side. It has been a pleasure to chair this meeting. I wish you a nice winter holiday. Have a good break, a good rest. I think we all need it. And again, I thank the interpretation, excellent interpretation as usual, and looking forward to seeing you in 22. Peaceful end of the year. Bye-bye.
Bye, thank you.